Her and EU, a European podcast on gender equality. Brought to you by the Martens Centre with Loredana Teodorescu.
Hello everybody and welcome to this new episode of Her and EU, a podcast on gender equality and women's role in the society. I am Loredana Teodorescu and our special guest of today is Katrina, better known as Kat Fotovat, from the Department of State of the United States. Kat is the Principal Deputy Director for the Secretary of State's Office of Global Women's Issues. And this is a very special episode because it's the first time that we have a guest from the United States, which allows us to enlarge our perspectives and also look at the possible cooperation between United States and European Union. So Kat, thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks so much, Loredana.
And I would like to start precisely from your own personal story. Kat, you have over 20 years of experience advocating gender and human rights globally, especially in conflict and post-conflict settings. And today you are also leading a team of gender experts working on women, peace and security agenda, but also countering violent extremism, promoting women's economic empowerment, combating gender-based violence. I mean, looking back, what have been the ingredients of your success and how being a woman has affected your career? You are a woman advocating for women's issues, so I'm wondering if this was ever an obstacle or an advantage for you.
I think that's a question that we all have to consider when we're talking about, working in women, peace, and security issues and women's leadership. It's really about, and where my success has been from women supporting women who have supported me and men who have supported me as well. So while I've been working on conflict and post-conflict issues, the needs and effectiveness of the work that we were doing to bring peace or to bring security or to bring safety or to make sure that women's leadership was something that was being included really came from, what I call a flow of, where the river is going to make sure that we are being all as effective together as possible. That success really comes from the fact that there's a need and making sure to address those needs from, wherever you can help support each other. So, there's a quote that Secretary Albright had about, there's a place in hell for women that don't support women. I fundamentally believe that she was 100% correct in that, and that hell could be, when you're talking about security and war and conflict, that is hell. And so when women don't support other women, and making sure to be able to achieve peace and peace for their communities, peace for their families, peace for their countries. We also need men involved in that as well. So I do believe very fundamentally that much of my success, as well as success of those around me, really has been dependent upon the strength of us and our unity together to gather forward.
That's really great. People supporting each other, women supporting other women, and I really also like that quote. But if we look, let's say, at what is happening around the world, we still see that women, especially in foreign policy, peace and security, diplomacy, are still underrepresented. And I'm wondering, from your perspective, from your experience, why the participation is still so low, and how we can try to foster a change. How are you trying to foster a change in your daily work?
Yeah, I think we've all seen, and at least we have the documentation, the data and the evidence to show how much more successful countries are if they are more equal in how they pursue democracy in terms of gender integration and gender inclusion. We have great examples, everything from, I look at President Sandu in Moldova, who has been able to hold a, steady opposition to Russian influence in the region. The quotas that have, also happened around Europe, including Moldova, the amazing women parliamentarians in Ukraine. Whenever a conflict or a crisis happens, you see women right away. They are the first ones to step up. They are the ones to help, clothe and shelter shelter and feed. And, that leadership, is just fundamentally where much of the courage of a country often comes from. We have great examples in Belarus and other places. I think we need to make sure that we are cognizant of all those initial, courageous women and their leadership. But as you've noted, what ultimately ends up happening is as time goes by, we see, women's representation diminished. Although I think globally there are more women in parliamentary roles than ever before, we've also seen women in higher level leadership, heads of state also decrease. I think part of that is, I think we are dealing in a new age of technology. Certainly, I have talked to women parliamentarians and leaders around the world, and there is such a disincentive for women wanting to get into this space of leadership because, women are disproportionately impacted, three to four times as much harassed online in terms of online safety and abuse, and it's not just towards them; it's towards their families. So one of the issues that comes up frequently is, when women leaders are attacked online, they don't just go after that woman on their looks or, on their policies. Never. It's usually about severe sexual harassment. And then they often go after their families. And that is a prospect that, ultimately in positions which aren't often well paying, they are sacrificing and putting at risk themselves and their families. And women are inherently very, very protective of their families and their communities. So that's been a huge disincentive, and we really need to figure out ways to work together to address that online harassment and abuse and those safety issues. We do in the United States, we've helped start a global partnership with our colleagues in Denmark. We have 11 other countries on addressing online harassment and abuse. But we also need to work with the social media companies and, try to figure out how to make sure that women safely can be able to promote their campaigns, be able to promote their efforts, be able to, women activists and leaders have a safe space online. We all work online. Everybody has a phone right now. Everybody's able to connect to anyone anywhere in the world. That's how communication happens. And so when, the first area that people go after to make sure that women cannot access that same public space where all these dialogues and discussions are happening is to make that not safe for them. So that becomes very, very difficult. I think the other issue, and just in terms of the conflict space, I think there's always been an inherent tension between expediency and making, quote unquote, peace work quickly versus effectively. We know that peace agreements are, more likely to last 15 years or more if women are included because they are on the front lines of conflicts and crisis. They are the first responders. They are the ones that, are often thinking of their communities and their families right away. And despite that, empirical evidence showing that it's important to include women in these spaces, I think the quest for peace and that urgency sometimes overtakes the fact that peace will not be as lasting or as effective if you're not making the effort to make sure to include women, or they are often overlooked because the men in power do not want to include them. There was a discussion that happened actually in the Balkans at one point, in which the men at the negotiating tables did not want to include women in the discussions because they felt like they were more likely to compromise on things to make sure that there actually was lasting peace. And, I remember just hearing stories about, women leaders that really fought to make sure that they were included in these discussions. And that's a very difficult thing to do. But we know inherently to make sure that really lasting peace happens and those peace builders, Loredana, I have to give you so much credit for building, such an incredible network of women peace builders who learn from each other. That is really how things get done and really have a lasting effect in the world. So I think we need to make safe spaces for women online. I think we need to make sure that we're connecting them together to support each other. And I think that, those individuals that are in leadership positions need to recognize that you will not have effective democracy or lasting peace without the inclusion of women throughout the work that's being done.
Thank you, Kat, for your incredible words. It's about power, it's about how we look at peace and the peace we are aiming at. It's about awareness, so raising the awareness on the contribute of women, as you rightly said. And thank you also for touching upon a less explored issue, which is the role of technology. I think that's very interesting. Also, what you launched together with other countries. And this brings me to another question I have in mind, which is looking at your country and your work. I mean, what kind of lessons can we learn from the work you are doing, also in terms of your strategy on gender equality, and also the work you are doing trying to break the silos between the different policy areas, for instance, trying to connect gender equality with climate action?
Yeah, I mean, I think we are very lucky, and I'm very proud to say that we have a national gender strategy that President Biden put into effect. It was one of his first acts. He put an executive order. It's 14020, and it mandates actually across the U.S. government that we include a gender perspective in all the work that's being done in foreign and domestic policy. And that includes gender budgeting, which, no country in the world is perfect at anything we do, but I would say gender budgeting is probably one of the more difficult areas to work on. Budgeting in general, the President Biden has said, show me your budget and I'll show you your priorities. I do think that he has taken that very seriously. We do have, for the first time, we've doubled our gender foreign assistance from $1.3 billion to $2.6 billion. And now the new request is actually raising that all the way up to $3.1 billion. So the United States is definitely putting its money where its mouth is on that. The executive order also established a gender policy council that reports directly to the President of the United States. So Jennifer Klein, who is the executive director of that gender policy council, is an advisor to the president. She directly talks to him almost on a daily basis, to make sure that women's issues and gender issues are taken into consideration. We also look at everything from an intersectional approach. So it's not just looking at one aspect of what gender equality means, but really looking at what are the different factors going into, our inclusion of gender issues into our foreign policy across the board. We want to make sure that we are looking at what the needs are and those intersectional and overlapping areas of discrimination and lack of access that they have. So that's another real focus for, our gender strategy. One of the other areas, and in talking about overlapping prioritization, going to the gender climate nexus, really getting to the more localized efforts. We know that women and children are disproportionately impacted by climate change. Women are more local farmers. Women are more inherently lacking in access to land and have less land rights. So really looking at those overlapping areas of making sure that we are being more inclusive in our policies on climate change. That also includes women's economic security. So where we see, making sure that when we're doing our education policies or when we're talking about girls in STEM areas, so science, technology, engineering, and math, making sure that these areas, which are up and coming and really where the world is going, whether it be technology or just engineering, looking at those science fields in a way that will be more inclusive and promote girls' empowerment in those spaces. I think that's something that we really need to make sure that we're focusing in on. And then, of course, that localized approach. So making sure that we are actively going and including the voices and experiences of women on the ground when we're talking about climate change. How does this actually affect them, their families, their communities? Again, when you start talking about agriculture and that access to those spaces of discussions, everything from incentives for, environmental protections or grants. We know that there's a lot of funding going into new innovations around the world on climate change. And one of the areas that we've seen is that women just do not often have the access to the financing. They either don't have, if whether it be angel investors or new investments made. That's an area where women really need to just even be able to have access to, be included in calls for proposals, and making sure that they're included in all of those discussions as well. So I think we have really worked towards trying to include climate and climate issues.
Thank you, Kat. You gave us really a comprehensive overview on your work. What kind of room do you see for EU-USA cooperation in these fields? What can we still be done together in order to achieve better results, in order to integrate women and gender perspectives in the different policies, and also in order to make sure that these topics are higher on the policy and the political agendas?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a lot of opportunities to work with the EU on cooperation in the gender areas. Certainly, as we were just discussing climate change, we have actually a new gender climate change strategy, and I think setting out those priorities and where those cross collaborations can come in, whether it be sharing technologies. We do actually also have our own podcast, called the Innovation Stations, where we share expertise from the United States with other countries, and do a lot of exchanges that way. I think that there are countries, certainly such as Romania, that just has a new age of consent law, which we're very excited about. So there's areas that we can work together to find out best practices, what has worked in our countries as well. However, we need to, and what's been working in various countries, I think that there's a lot of overlapping areas to have those exchange and dialogues. And certainly, as we were noting, the technology facilitated gender-based violence issues, that is, that the internet has no borders. And so, making sure that we are working together in addressing those, various concerns, whether, the attacks are coming from the United States or they're coming from other countries, we need to find ways to work together to stop that, to create safe spaces for women and children online.
That's great, and I actually really believe that there is a lot of room for cooperation and that we can create synergies in order to achieve, let's say, common priorities and overcome common challenges. Let me very briefly touch upon Women, Peace and Security agenda, because I know that this is, let's say, in your heart. And I really believe that this is particularly relevant now when peace and security are globally challenged, from Ukraine to the Middle East to the African continent. How can we advance the Women, Peace and Security agenda together? How we can leverage the agenda and find more room for cooperation in this regard?
That, as you noted, that's something very near and dear to my heart. And every time a conflict comes up or starts, or we're evaluating what's happened in a particular crisis area, I think we need to make sure that we continually are reevaluating, the effectiveness or how we are including gender perspectives into crisis and conflict management. So we stop making the same mistakes over and over and over. And to move that ball forward, I think, we need to look at new and innovative ways of connecting women and girls. For example, Loredana, again, I have to give you much credit for, much of the Women Peace Builders networks. We have found, throughout COVID, one of the, I think, lessons learned from that, and I hope we continue to remember the lessons learned from COVID, was really how we could actually connect people around the world. We do have this is one of the good things about technology, is that we have the ability to actually bring them in and talk to, people around the world, no matter where they are, and learn from each other. And I think that, making sure that we are ensuring women's full and equal and meaningful participation in all decision-making processes is vital to make sure that we can move that agenda forward. And then that comes into this, area of of kind of looking at knowledge management, knowledge mobilization. How do we make sure that the evidence and information is there and available, for women peace builders around the world? And so, the United States has been working. Last year was the first time we've ever chaired the UN Focal Points Network on Women, Peace, and Security with our co-chairs, Romania. We took on and looked at exactly this question: how do we continue to push the agenda forward on women, peace, and security? And a lot of it really came down to making sure that tools and knowledge was shared. People were connected, they were supported. We started to work on areas that many countries have been looking at in terms of having centers of excellence that can be regional hubs for sharing that information, for bringing, women peace builders and leaders together, working on national action plans together. What are those best practices? Other than just putting things on paper, how do we actually mobilize information and activists together to make sure that that's something that leaders can utilize to change their countries and change their regions? So these are areas that we certainly have been promoting and looking at new and innovative ways to continue to have these discussions and build upon each other's, incredible work and leadership. Because we know that, women's movements, when women come together, we can get anything done. So we want to make sure that we are highlighting that and moving that forward.
Thank you so much, Kat, first of all, for the time, but especially for your commitment to the Martin Center for making this podcast possible. And thank you all for listening. Stay tuned for the next episode.
Thank you.
That was today's episode of Her and EU. Subscribe to our podcast for more.